This episode of Deep in the Weeds is proudly supported by Olsen Salt, makers of Australian sea salt since 1948.
I think kitchens for me was a way of getting away from my mates and having a reason to go to, I need to go to work, I'm working on the weekend, I can't do that. I can't go steal cars and, go and smoke dope and get locked up. As someone who had an accent and had a grade 11 education, it's an environment. If you work hard and you're committed and you read and you work your ass off, you can do quite well.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Many chefs spend their entire careers mastering their craft in a singular manner. Once they've found their voice and their cuisine, they refine and refine. There are a few that have the ability to reinvent themselves continually and deliver new experiences that set a new benchmark of excellence. Ross Lusted is the chef owner of Woodcut restaurant in Sydney. Ross, how are you going?
Very good. Nice to talk to you, Huck.
Mate, it's very good to catch up. You are running quite a large establishment, very different to the days of the Bridge Room, which was a pretty small restaurant and kitchen. How does life compare to those times?
Oh, look, I think, life's a funny thing. And I think as humans, if you can adapt to your environment, I do everything for a reason, obviously. And the Bridge Room was for a reason. And it was what it was, and it did what it did. It probably did a bit more than it should have done for the size of the restaurant and the size of that kitchen. But it was one thing that I needed to do, and it got me onto the journey where I am now. And this is where I am now is much more in my comfort zone, to be honest.
You've had this incredible ability to reinvent yourself with multiple career changes and establishments over your career, and really made a success of them, and also gone out on the top with them to move on to something else. What's the drive there with all these continual evolution and change?
Look, for me personally, I've never identified with I'm a chef or I'm an artist or I'm a business person or I'm a property developer or a hotelier or whatever. I think opportunities come your way and you find them as well. And I've never said, well, I just don't know that I can really do that. I don't have the skills to do that. I'm very inspired by people who, you take a Richard Branson. What's Richard Branson's qualifications? He runs airlines, he runs .coms, he runs telcos. I think at the end of the day, I'm a creative person, and where I find myself, I'm drawn towards things that really interest me. And I think if they interest you, you take the skills that you have and the skills that you've learned, and that might be in a kitchen, that might be on a building site, that might be at art school, and then you apply that to whatever is sort of in your focus at the moment.
Let's go back to the early days, back what food was like for you, and when you first got interested in food and realised that would be a career for you.
I never really got interested in food. I think I got interested in the environment. I grew up in the country in South Africa, and it's only when I really started cooking Thai food with David Thompson that I realised that, wow, I had this whole cultural heritage within South Africa, which is, Cape Malay food and what we sort of identify with as Malaysian, Indonesian, and then it has the Dutch and English influence in South Africa. But those were my memories of South Africa, and then we moved to Brisbane and never really, my parents, I hope they're not listening, but were never terribly good cooks. But we always ate everything that was in season and everything that was fresh. And I remember, eating a rock melon in South Africa and realising that that's just how Rockmelon was always, should always be, until I came to Australia and that you could, kill someone with a Rockmelon. It was that hard. And so it was sort of those things that I suppose I remember the spices and I remember the smells, and I remember going to a Chinese restaurant, and I think I was 7 or 8 years old, and I ordered the stir-fried beef with black bean, and my dad was like, "You're not going to eat that," and I was determined. Always had that bit of determined in me, but so when we came to Australia and lived in Brisbane, I was going to be a dentist.
Wow.
Yeah, the white jacket's probably the only thing I kept out of that. But, so it was sort of predetermined, I suppose. Dad's an engineer and Mum's an artist and a teacher. And so we sort of grew up in a really creative household. I always made sculpture. We had welders and made things out of steel and timber and all that, more as just I enjoyed it, and painted. And our next door neighbour actually worked in a restaurant, and they needed someone to help on the Christmas holidays. And I said, yeah, I can do that. And it was like another world. There was hot waitresses, there were gay people. You could get home at midnight and no one questioned anything. Alcohol. The kitchen hands used to go out the back and smoke a massive joint and listen to Led Zeppelin. There was like a dent in one of the sinks because the guy's knee, he was so stoned, he used to bang his knee into listening to Zeppelin on the headset. And it was just like, this is where I fit in. This is freaking awesome, And I think the one thing, I was put up a year when I came from South Africa, because we had national service in South Africa. So you go back, you do 10 years of education as opposed to 12. So they cram it in. So it was a real challenge for me being put up a year, because all the kids were a year older, and then I went to public school, and some kids were kept down, so they were 2 years older. So when you walk on the rugby field, it's like, fuck, I'm just not tackling that guy. There's no way in the world. I was like a bean, So it was I found I struggled with school in Australia. So, I shaved my head and wore big Doc Marten boots and had braces and, hung out with all the punks and skinheads. And that's the music I grew up with in South Africa as well. There was a lot of, Bob Marley was banned because of his political voice. Mandela was still in prison in South Africa. Mum and Dad had issues with apartheid, so we left South Africa. But it was the music that I was drawn to and still am, really, reggae, ska, punk. So I had a sort of got into a bit of trouble, and I think kitchens for me was a way of getting away from my mates and having a reason to I need to go to work, I'm working on the weekend, I can't do that. I can't go steal cars and, go and smoke dope and get locked up. So for me, kitchens were escape, and as someone who had an accent and had a grade 11 education, it's an environment. If you work hard and you're committed and you read and you work your ass off, you can do quite well.
You mentioned working with David Thompson. Can you take us back to that time? What was it like in that kitchen?
I'm still having therapy, but I worked hard. People have asked me, how long do you need to be an apprentice, and then a commie, and then a chef de partie. I said, I don't really know. I went from being thrown out of culinary school to being a head chef at 19. So I've never really done the journey, and I'm not being arrogant about that. I literally took a job with a cookbook in my back pocket. I was head chef of a restaurant in a 5-star hotel in Brisbane, and the corporate chef turned around to me one day and he said, "You really have no idea, do you?" And I said, "No." and he said, the fact that you agreed that you had no idea, he said, is the reason you still have a job. But I said, I just want to do it. I want to work it out. And he actually took me under his wing, and he was a 2-star chef from Toulouse in France. And, he's the guy who said, this is what caviar tastes like, and this is what goat's cheese is, and eat this piece of pate every day. I know you hate it, but you'll get to like it. And explain what the difference were, with capers and, real capers and why you use Armagnac in cooking, and, made I don't know how much I can digress here, but we would make a velouté, which is generally, flour, white wine, butter, and then you add whatever stock you want to it, and you whisk it all up, and you have like a thick base sauce. So he would say, no, you do 1 part onion, 1 part leek, 1 part celeriac, 1 part fennel. You cook that, and then you add your white wine, reduce it by half, add your fish stock, reduce that, and then add the cream and blend that up. So no flour, So it was that time of, I suppose I'm pretty old, so I learned how to cook, let's say, properly, to understand how to make a hollandaise sauce and a proper reduction and make stocks and sauces and all that sort of stuff. And that was my founding, that was my base, and that was my go-to all the time. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but so I worked and I opened the Ritz-Carlton in Double Bay, and I worked for Neil at MCA very briefly because I thought he was an arsehole, and I left. And but we'll get back to that. And because there was no structure. I went to MCA and there was no structure. There was, everyone was doing their own thing. There was no recipes. There was no standardization. I just come out of this really formal, structured kitchen with a very clear hierarchy and no grey areas. And then I went to, MCA with Neil, where, everything was about actually cooking, flavour. I never really got it. And because it was all in the moment, a piece of grilled octopus with tarator and some torn parsley and a squeeze of lemon over it. It was like, what the fuck's that? And where's the recipe for tarator? Well, you just make it. You roast the walnuts and you blend it with garlic. And it was like, yeah, but where's the recipe? It was like, well, just cook it, So I had a meal. I went to Darley Street Thai and I had a meal. And this is Darley Street in Newtown, the original Darley Street. And obviously that's where it gets its name, because it was in a pub in St. Peter in Darley Street. And I went there and I had this crispy fish with sweet pork and green mango. And I remember Martin, the waiter, I didn't know his name at the time, but Martin brought this crispy fish to me. And I said to him, oh, sorry, I ordered the crispy fish. And he turned around and said, darling, that is the crispy fish. And in the only way that Martin could deliver that, and which I didn't do very well, but overtly camp, the whole place was. But I had this meal, and I think I'd been cooking for about 10 years, and I had no idea how they made this dish. And it disturbed me that much that I quit my job. And I was working 6 days a week at the Ritz-Carlton. Those are the days before 38 hours. And I only had Sundays off. And I said to my now ex-wife, I'm going to go and work at Darley Street as a stagiaire on Sundays. And needless to say, my ex-wife. But I went there on a Sunday and I turned up and there was this enormous guy called David King. A lot of people won't remember David King unless you're my age, but David King was one of the most talented chefs in Australia. He won the Josephine Pignolet Award. Incredibly humble, like an absolute freaking rock. You could never crack this guy. I remember him putting his hand into a mincer making curry paste, and he sort of removed one digit.
Whoa.
And he looked at me and he said, Roscoe, can you come turn the machine off? And I said, are you all right, Dave? And he said, I think I might need to get a Band-Aid. And I'm like, fuck, Dave, you need to go to the hospital, mate. It's like, but Dave was this just incredibly solid guy, and he was at Darley Street. And I said, oh, I'm here, me, bright and chirpy, walked in, and this guy looked at me like, who's this fucking idiot? And I said, oh, I'm here to do a stage. I spoke to Tomo and actually it was Chef Thompson. I spoke to Chef Thompson. He looked at me like, who's that? And anyway, he said, well, I don't know anything about it. And I said, well, I'm here. And he gave me like the biggest bag of chilies. I stood in the corner and I did the chilies. My hands, everything, my eyes, every part of me was burning. And I thought, this prick, I'm just going to not let him. So anyway, we went through, he showed me nothing, and I kept going back, and it was about the third or fourth Sunday. And I said, he muttered something under his breath in Afrikaans, and I turned around and I answered him back in Afrikaans, and he said, where are you from? I said, where the fuck are you from? And it was just like, and that was it. He was this, just hard-assed, Afrikaner that I suppose we had the same upbringing, and he'd just been through shit, I'd been through shit, and we bonded that day. And it was like, I said, like, why are you such a fucking arsehole? He said, you're just one of these pricks from Rockpool who wants to come and get all the recipes and go off and, I said, mate, I'm not interested in that. I said, I work at the Ritz-Carlton, so it was just funny because we sort of had a really good connection, and he said, the only reason you're here is so Tomo can go out on Saturday night and not have to come in on Sunday. And that was a fact, So I moved to Darley Street and in King's Cross, and that's another whole story in itself. It was another kitchen that was out of control. Marty Boots was my apprentice. Who else was there? It was like so many people who were. Stuart Halliday was a young waiter. We used to deep fry. Stewie could not stop eating shit, and every time there was something on the pass, he would eat it, and Tomo would go off his dial. So one day we got like a scouring pad, cut it up into little pieces, deep fried it in batter, put it on the pass. And we were just watching heads down, and Stewie'd come in, oh, chef, do you want a coffee? Yeah, sure, thanks, Stewie, And you could just see, he thought this must be pork or something, So he steals a bit, and then he actually ate it, and then came back and thought, that was a bit, maybe I got a piece of gristle or something, And we're just like going through our day. And it was just one of those kitchens, and he took another piece, and then he opened it up and realised, and we were just all, and then I think Tomo threw oyster sauce at him in the middle of the restaurant one day. People shooting heroin in the back lane on your way to work in the morning, and it was the Cross, and we were, 20 out of 20 in the, I think it was Financial Review. David Dale wrote the article, and it was off the charts. A kitchen where you were a number in the kitchen, and every number in that kitchen had to be there. You couldn't just call in sick, or you couldn't just, Dave King would say, someone would walk in for a trial shift, and Dave would just say, yeah, they're not going to make it. And the guy just walked in the door and put on his apron. And it was a really, really hard kitchen.
This episode of Deep in the Weeds is proudly supported by Olsen Salt, Australia's oldest family-owned salt company.
It's probably one of the most sustainable industries on earth. There have been salt fields in Africa and Europe for thousands of years that they're still taking salt off. And, the product is beautiful, and I'm really proud of it. Hi, I'm Alex Olsen from Olsen Sea Salt. Salt all over the world can taste differently, and that's because salt has character, in the same way that a wine has character from where it's grown. So salt from the Eyre Peninsula has a very fresh, clean, crisp flavour that some of the best chefs in Australia appreciate. My father took 10 years to develop the sea salt flakes, and he didn't want to release them until they were good enough to be put on the world stage. And this is a justification of that 10 years of hard work that he put into making the sea salt flakes world standard, and an affirmation to him that what he did and all those plans and all that hard work has not been in vain.
For more information, go to olsons.com.au. You briefly mentioned your experience working at the MCA with Neil, and you also spent time at Rockpool. Tell us a bit about that time and what you took from that period.
Yeah, I'd done about 3 years at Rockpool, and I never envisaged working for Neil again. And Khan Dennis, who was the chef at Rockpool at the time, sort of put Neil and I back together, and I think it was over quite a few beers, and we told each other what we thought of each other, and I ended up opening Rockpool for Neil in Potts Point, which is now Miss G's, the building. And from Rockpool, I was studying sculpture at the time, and it's all a bit of a blur, the years, but I stuck a chisel through my hand, and I couldn't work in a kitchen for 6 months. And at that time, Neil had won the Qantas contract to do first-class food. So I ended up travelling the world with Sussman, going to Bangkok, Hong Kong, Singapore, Frankfurt, London, everywhere that Qantas flew first class. And I worked with Neil on the menus and the rollout of the first-class product. Yeah.
Wow.
So I did that for about a year, and then ended up being the chef at Rockpool. And that was, I remember Sue Jenkins, who owned Accoutrement, put out a publication of the chefs, the 2021 great chefs of Australia, and it was Yanni Christus and Damien Pignolet, Philip Searle, Chrissy Manfield. No, I don't know if Chrissy was in there, but Neil was in there, Peter Doyle, Greg Doyle. And it was that sort of people that, for me, I always admired and looked up to. And, Australia, we're so far from the rest of the world that I think to be recognised, Australian chefs have worked much harder. I don't know if that's the right thing to say, but it's like almost, and maybe this is just me through my eyes, but always jumping on your box going, hey, look at us. We're down here. We're doing stuff that's really interesting, And when Australian chefs did come here, when international chefs did come here, they were always blown away at the quality of the produce, the quality of the restaurants, the service, the food, the wine. And I think Australia, and I've lived in 12 countries, so I've seen and travelled and a lot. And every time I come back to Australia, it's always been the benchmark for me. And Europe is definitely a benchmark, and so is the US for me in terms of the scale of restaurants and the volume, and that's a little bit of what Woodcut is. And, that idea that these big businesses, when Terence Conrad had his restaurants in London, and looking at that, and for me walking into Rockpool was that it was this incredibly international, super creative food, everything in the moment. I mean, Rockpool, I have 53 chefs now in Woodcut, and at Rockpool there was 35, and they were majority of them were apprentices, and I don't think I have one apprentice today, and that's telling of our industry today. But 35 apprentices. I remember we actually pulled them all out of TAFE. Neil he just disagreed with what they were teaching them, and we sort of had this lunch where we invited these TAFE teachers to showcase what we were doing at Rockpool. And 35 apprentices going 1 day a week is 35 days a week that we had to have staff out of our kitchen. So Neil's argument was, well, if we can train them in pastry, if we can train them in our seafood, because at the time there was Rockpool in Potts Point. Not in Potts Point, there was Rockpool in Darley Harbour. And we had a full fish production facility there. If we could show the butchery, fishmongering, work with our fruit and veg suppliers, who was Matt Brown at the time, work in a bakery, with Victoire, all those sorts of things were why are we sending our people to TAFE when we could be training them in-house. And I remember the guy, one of the teachers who came from Brisbane for this lunch, he's the guy that actually said I'd never amount to being anything, and from TAFE. And it just shows that our industry is constantly moving, and unless the rest of the institutions that support our industry are not constantly moving, then staff need to move from restaurant to restaurant. Everyone said to me, your CV is terrible because you keep jumping around. I'm like, yeah, but I've just learnt everything I think I can learn from that one kitchen. So if you have to move, and for me it's worked, for some people it doesn't work. But Rockpool was one of those restaurants where after Darley Street, Rockpool, it was yet again another chef, incredibly amazing palate, Neil, and just a true restaurateur, in every sense. I think he was front of house as much as he was back of house in terms of the wine program. I learnt a lot from Neil. I learnt about marketing yourself, about being ambitious. I think Neil's opened more restaurants and closed more restaurants than a lot of people in Australia. And people might look at that as a bad thing. I just say that's ambition. That's putting it out there. That's having a go. Who would have known? And he's left us with some of the most amazing memories of restaurants for me personally. So Rockpool was an amazing time, but it was a time where I did my time there and I really enjoyed it. And the Park Hyatt kept knocking on the door, and I said to them, they invited me down there for a drink one night after work, and Willie Martin was the GM, and I said, look, Willie, hotels are just not for me. I said, I don't understand it. I don't, because, the chef is one person in the hotel, and you have an executive committee, and the chef's never on the executive committee, so you don't have a voice. It's always through the food and beverage director. And so they invited me down for a drink one night, and we're sitting in the veranda bar, and this is pre-Harbour Kitchen and Bar. You probably don't even remember that, Huck, but
I do, sadly.
Yeah. And someone had just probably dropped $600 in number 7, and they walked behind us, and they were in the lobby. Someone was vacuuming the carpet, and they couldn't get their keys. They couldn't find a bellboy, and these guys were prattling on about me working for Hyatt. And I said, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I said, the reason I'll never work for Hyatt is, I said, that guy's just dropped $600. He probably had someone park his vehicle when they arrived. It was this great entry, this experience, and now they've left, and it's only midnight and they're vacuuming the carpets, which could be done at 3 in the morning. No one's there to get his keys. And I said, so that's the experience that is, from a restaurant once they step out the door, that's where it ends. And at hotels it doesn't. And the guy said to me, well, that's why we want you to work for us. And I said, well, I don't know who you two guys are, but I know who Willie Martin was. And he said, well, actually, I'm the president of Hyatt, so if you want to be on the executive committee, you'll be on the executive committee. And so that started my sort of return to hotels.
That led to you traveling the world for your career, and a lot of people in Australia may know you from the Bridge Room, and you and your wife Sunny kind of landed and delivered sunlight on a plate at the Bridge Room at a time that Australia was really finding its voice in regards to food, and the Bridge Room just took off. But previous to that, not many people may know you were traversing the globe, doing some pretty incredible things.
Yeah, I was right there at the opening of a restaurant called Mezzanine in the Grand Hyatt in Singapore. And Mezzanine, it changed restaurants significantly. It was 450 seats, 9 private dining rooms, 9 open kitchens, full Cantonese. It was in 4 languages, so I had Japanese chefs, Cantonese chefs who only spoke Cantonese. They didn't speak Mandarin. And then we had Singaporean chefs, Malaysians, Thai, and then a whole lot of Europeans. And we used to do, I think it was $1 million a week in revenue. It was a restaurant that it won best restaurant in Asia like 5 times. And Hyatt always put their restaurants above their rooms. Well, F&B did anyway. Andreas was incredibly arrogant and very driven, and restaurants. If you're staying at the Grand Hyatt Singapore and you hadn't booked mezzanine when you booked your accommodation, well, that was your problem. You weren't going to get a seat just because you were a hotel guest. And they ran it like freestanding restaurants, and our P&Ls and all our ROIs we were responsible for that. The hotel was not going to help us in terms of appropriating revenue. So I learned a lot in that. I learned a lot about business. I learned a lot about creating wealth out of restaurants and what you could do. And when I was telling you the story before about when I was 19, I had a cookbook in my back pocket. Well, that was a hotel in Brisbane. I am digressing here, Hux, I know I am, but there is a method to the madness. But that corporate chef who I worked for, Luke Thibault, was actually working for a guy called Adrian Zacher. And Adrian Zacher had started Beaufort Hotels. His first hotel company was Regent, that he started, and then he sold Regent and did Beaufort. And there was a Beaufort in Brisbane and Darwin and Sukhothai in Bangkok. And I'd met Adrian very briefly in Brisbane when I was about 19 or 20. And he said to me, I'm opening a new hotel company and we're opening a hotel in Bali. Do you want to come to Bali with me? And I said, where's Bali? I didn't know where Bali was. And I said, no, I'm going to work for Neil Perry. That's when I went to MCA. And I hadn't really stayed in touch with Adrian, and this was probably 10 years later. And Adrian Zacher walked into Mezzanine in Singapore, and he's like, what the hell are you doing in this big factory, which was a very big restaurant. And then a couple of plane tickets and an invitation to Amankila was delivered to us. And Sunny, I'd met Sunny in Park Hyatt, Sydney, and she was in Chicago and I was living in Singapore. So we ended up going to Amankila in East Bali, and we met the GM there. And he sort of said, what are you guys doing here? And we said, actually, we have no idea. And we were just invited by Adrian. And then we got back to Singapore. So we stayed there for 3 days. It was fantastic. And we got back to Singapore and we had lunch with Adrian, and he said, so how was Bali? I said, it was amazing. And he said, well, why don't you go and live there for a couple of years and look after my friends? And Adrian, that's his idea of a job description. As a hotel general manager, you're going to live in one of his houses and look after his friends that come and stay. And that literally was our job description. So we joined Aman Resorts as joint general managers of Amankila. And since then, Sunny and I have worked together for 20-something years. So we took this job, I'll never forget, as general managers. And I said to Adrian, I don't know anything about being a general manager of a hotel. He said, fantastic. He said, you'll be the best GM. He said, the last thing I want to do is hire a general manager of a hotel. And we literally, you were left to your own devices, And the one thing about being a chef and also being, Sunny in terms of rooms division, you understand, that we don't put our stuff in an in-tray on Friday afternoon and deal with it on Monday morning again. In a restaurant as a chef, the prep has to be done. You got people walking in the door at 6 o'clock. If you're not fucking ready, you're not ready. And if you're not ready, you're going down. And if you go down, your restaurant shuts. You're out of business. And Adrian loved the idea that everything that we did at Amankila was you just did it. You just got on with it. And you made decisions and you were empowered to do that. And I think that's for me, that's when I suddenly went, you know what? I can do this shit. And I'd worked it out, and I loved the hotel management. I loved being on the other side of it. I loved watching the revenue. I liked putting in systems. I'm a very systems-orientated person. There are no grey areas in my life, and I'm working on that. But there's no democracy, and I'm working on that. But I think you have to have a vision, and Adrian Zacher clearly had a vision. And when the Bali bomb happened, obviously we were two people who had a different skill set, being Sunny and I, and we were brought back to the corporate office in Singapore And Adrian had this very aggressive rollout that he wanted to do for Aman Resorts. So I was put into development, and Sonny was headed up marketing and sales for Aman worldwide, and I had a worldwide development role.
Wow.
I had sort of 12 years of just incredible, I travelled for 9 months of the year. And then I'd sort of had this inkling that I wanted to cook again, and living in all these different countries, I kept a journal of my travels, and I was almost becoming a better chef by not cooking, if that makes sense.
Mm.
I was traveling, I was being a customer in restaurants, and I would leave and I'd sort of go home and write down what was so good about that, what was shit about that, why didn't that work, why would they have such an uncomfortable chair, and why was the table the wrong height, and that light just annoyed me all night. And, the music was just terrible, or there was, I sound pretty depressing here, but, and then there was the stuff that was just so amazing. So the last project we did was Amangiri in Utah, and that for me was the most freedom that Adrian ever gave us to do a project. And Amangiri won Best Resort in the world, and it's won it twice. It was one of the most extraordinary projects because it was 3 people and 1 voice, and it was all about the building and the architecture and the landscape. And it was one of the most creative periods. And during that time, I was thinking, I need to do this for myself. And I wanted to cook again. And the chefs in America that we hired for that resort, it was a disaster. I hired them, so I take responsibility for that. But I ended up having to be in the kitchen just to train people. And Sonny sort of said to me, I know you said you're going to do that for 2 weeks, but it's been 2 months now. And I said, yeah, you know what? I said, I think I want to open a restaurant. And she's like, are you fucking mad?
Tomorrow, in part 2, Ross tells us about the challenges and successes of the Bridge Room in Sydney and how it led to what may be the defining moment in his career with Woodcut Restaurant.
This for me is now this is what we've been training for. This is what we've been travelling for. This is what we've been giving up our time for. This is what the compromises have been for. And Woodcut for me it's just the dream restaurant.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we share the stories of Australia's hospo community, suppliers and producers in search of hope during this pandemic. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.